you have to ask the question, what happens if they don't extend it? So, putting a $3 to $4 trillion tax hikes on families, Main Street businesses, on American competitiveness has real consequences for lower paychecks, much slower growth in the economy, U.S. less competitive at a time China's super aggressive. You know what I mean? They want to dominate our industries and technologies. And so I think it's going to be crucial for both parties to find a way forward to extend those tax cuts, especially for those families, Main Street businesses, and our competitiveness. You may remember the reason we did it was that for a decade before 2017, the economy was slow growth, less than 2% for a decade. Paychecks have been flat, and every other month we saw another U.S. company move overseas. So we had to modernize the code in a big way, lower rates, but we did it in such a way we created code built for growth of jobs and the economy and paycheck. We wanted to make sure we were the desirable location for new plants, innovation. We did that. We wanted one of the most competitive economies on the planet. We did that. And as a result, paychecks, the thing I think I'm proudest of, in the first 3 years after tax reform, paychecks, inflation adjusted, went up 9%, the highest level since we began keeping records. So people were getting ahead in a big way. That's really the legacy of those cuts and why Congress has to find a way to extend those or make them permanent.
But people were getting ahead. At the same time, the deficit was growing. So if you, as you say, businesses and consumers actually need these to stay in place, how do you make it fiscally responsible?
Yeah, so the good news is there's ways, and here's why. People remember the tax cuts is costing $1.5 trillion, even though we've seen record revenue. Like corporate rate revenue today is higher at 21% than it was at 35% because of the growth. So we've seen good growth. But bottom line is the actual cuts were $5.5 trillion. We paid for $4 trillion of it. Reforms to lower the rates, to modernize the code, and to grow the economy in a big way. So lawmakers, as they extend the tax cuts, will also extend the reforms that help pay for it. That won't cover all of it. It's a good, solid step. So depending on the party, depending on in an era where deficit and debts really matter, both parties are going to have to decide, so do we pay for all of it? Do we pay for most of it? What does that good policy look there? And so they're going to have to be looking at similar type reforms as we did in 2017 going forward for that very reason, to make sure we're not adding significant amounts to the debt.
But you're sitting down there in Texas looking up at this crowd now. And we can hardly figure out a budget to pay for the government, never mind deal with a debt ceiling that's going to be looming. Do you trust the people who currently serve in Congress to do what you just said, extend the tax cuts and find a way to pay for it?
I do, and here's why. I think there's a middle class in Congress, people you don't see or hear about often. They are very solid, trying to do the right thing, serious lawmakers, and they're going to be the ones to be putting these packages together.
Are they on both sides of the aisle?
So I believe there is. And I think that they can, because sort of like 2012 when we saw the Bush tax cuts expire, both parties had a lot at stake, in that. And they do again in 2025. The thing is, my point is, don't just extend or make permanent, keep improving the tax code. We can be more pro-growth. It can be simpler, especially on small businesses. Things have changed, because of China is so super competitive. AI has changed things. Innovation should be, especially for our U.S. companies, the country that wins the innovation race wins the future. And ACT's top priorities are keep America competitive, make us the most desirable place for those new plants to innovation, keep incentivizing innovation in the U.S. And I think those are policies both parties, I think, can embrace.
Well, it's going to be one party, or at least the majority of the parties in both chambers, meeting with Donald Trump when he's here in Washington tomorrow. To what extent is he already influential on this conversation, knowing that there was a bipartisan tax bill that passed the House with massive bipartisan majority that ended up going nowhere in the Senate? And some people were telling us it's because it's an election year. And if you expand the child tax credit, potentially Biden gets credit for it. It becomes political. I wonder what you think of that narrative.
Yeah, so I think, President Trump's very influential, certainly among the Republican Party. These drove his economic agenda that is so popular with the American people. So he's got a big stake in extending that. And the corporate rate cut, for example, that drove so much of the paycheck wage growth was his signature achievement. So he's going to play a big role. I think some of the dynamics of this year's tax bill will still be front and center in 2025. You know, you're going to have businesses, you know, Republicans that want the middle class cuts, the small business cuts to remain in place, and want America to be super competitive. Democrats are going to want a child tax credit that looks like the COVID era credit. They're going to want to defend the green energy subsidies, Inflation Reduction Act. So you can already see sort of the battle lines being drawn. But 2025, with the prospect of $3 or $4 trillion of tax hikes, it's going to focus leaders in both those parties, tax writers, who are already beginning their work.
We're still waiting for the tax code to fit on a postcard. Wasn't that going to happen?
You know, I'll tell you what, in the House, we did exactly that. Our version was 13 lines on a postcard that 90% of Americans would use to file. I still dream about that. Because,
I'm sure there are many others.
Can you imagine you and I looking at a postcard and saying, this is how I'm taxed, and more importantly, that's how my neighbor is taxed. There's real power to simplicity. So I'm, you know, if you ask me things I dream about, I wish we could have actually achieved, you know, the postcard, and that fairness from that is certainly one of them.
On the subject of what could be dream and what could be achievable, we had Donald Trump over this past weekend in Nevada floating no taxes on tipped income.
Yeah.
Do you think that is actually something workable, knowing he would need congressional approval to actually do that in a second administration? Or do you think that was just kind of an idea that was thrown out there given the audience?
No, I think it doesn't surprise me. And here's why. Because during tax reform especially, you couldn't be at the White House that he wasn't asking, what are we doing for the little guys? What are we doing for the blue collar workers? I mean, that is part of who he is. I don't know tons about the tip thing, but here's, so full disclosure. I'm one of those people. I want fewer tax provisions for some, lower rates for everyone. I think that's the fairness here. But I think there's two impacts. One, if you tax less of something, you get more of it. So I think there'll be more wages sort of redesigned on the tip model. Secondly, those are industries that really have trouble hiring people and keeping them. You know what I mean? Those service industries. So you may see more young people. I was a waiter and a bartender. I've lived that tip life as well. And so you may see more people drawn to some of those service industries that traditionally, you know, it's been hard to cover those tables.
That's for sure.
Yeah.